Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Prepare to be spooked as we delve into the dark histories of Texas ghost towns, uncovering stories of tragedy, betrayal, and unexplained phenomena. From chilling tales of lost souls to unsolved mysteries that continue to baffle investigators, these abandoned towns are steeped in an unsettling energy that will leave you questioning what truly happened. But before we begin, here's something strange. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing. And by doing so, they miss out on the creepiest, spine-tingling tales that only the bravest dare to hear. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button now, because tonight's just the beginning, and the terror waiting in the darkness is far from over. So, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Let me know in the comments, because here, the night is only getting started, and the horror is waiting to unfold. Now, let's dive into the darkness. Out in the vast emptiness of the Big Bend, where the sun burns like a relentless furnace and the earth cracks open like an old wound, there's a place called Terlingua. It's not a town anymore, at least not in the way people think of towns. Terlingua is a graveyard made of dust and rust, a memory bleeding through the desert silence. But it wasn't always this way. 100 years ago, Terlingua was alive. It was a roaring, ragged beacon for anyone desperate enough to dig for mercury, the poison metal that could make a man rich beyond his wildest dreams, or kill him just as fast. In those early days, Terlingua was crawling with people. Men with hands the color of dust and eyes full of hunger poured in from all directions. They came by wagon, by train, by anything that could carry them through the brutal heat and endless miles of scrubland. The town sprung up like a weed, fast and furious. Shacks built from scrap wood, tents crowded with families, miners' boots kicking up dust in the street, voices raised in laughter and curses. The smell of sweat, gunpowder, and crude whiskey filled the air. The mines themselves yawned wide like hungry mouths, swallowing the brave and the foolish who dared to go down into the dark. But the real danger wasn't in the shadows underground. It was the mercury. Known to the locals as quicksilver, it was liquid metal that shimmered and danced, but it was a killer. The miners didn't know this at first. They worked long hours in tunnels thick with dust and fumes, breathing in the invisible poison with every desperate gasp. At first, the symptoms were mild. A cough here, a headache there. Men joked about the miner's cough, brushing it off like an inconvenient nuisance. But the cough grew harsher, more persistent, turning into a rasp that tore at the chest. The mercury seeped into their bodies, shutting down nerves, burning brains, poisoning lungs. Men who were strong and young became pale and wasted away. Their eyes sunken, their skin dry and cracked, their breath coming in short, rattling gasps. Doctors were scarce in Terlingua, and the mining companies didn't care. They told the men to keep digging, to push past the pain, because the mercury was money, and money meant survival. But survival was a cruel joke. The miners dropped one by one, some disappearing underground, others dying in their beds, coughing blood into the night. Their graves were shallow, many marked only by a broken shovel or a faded boot. The desert wind swept over them, erasing their names from memory. As the years dragged on, the town's heartbeat slowed. The laughter faded into silence. The clatter of machinery stopped. The mines closed one by one, abandoned like broken promises. The cabins sagged and leaned, wooden bones cracking and creaking in the wind. Rusted carts sat frozen on twisted rails, their wheels half buried in sand. The streets were empty, except for the wind, a dry, mournful sigh that seemed to carry the voices of the dead. And if you listen close, on cold desert nights when the moon hangs low and silver over the hills, you can still hear it. The coughing, the rasping breaths, rough and desperate, the whispers of men long gone but never gone. Visitors to the ruins tell stories of shadowy figures standing on the ridges, watching silently with hollow eyes. Some feel a sudden chill, a cold that seeps into their bones, even in the heat of the day. Others swear the desert itself seems alive, as if it remembers every man who died for the mercury beneath its skin. There's a story passed around by the few who've dared to stay after dark about a miner named Amos. Amos was one of the first to fall ill, a burly man with a booming laugh and hands as strong as iron. When his cough turned harsh, he refused to leave the mines. He said the mercury was his fortune, and he'd rather die with it than without. The last time anyone saw Amos alive, he was heading down into the depths, coughing and clutching his chest. When his friends went looking for him, the mine was empty. But in the quiet, you can still hear that coughing echoing from the old shaft, deep and ragged, like a ghost chained to the earth. Terlingua is more than a ghost town. It's a wound in the desert, bleeding sorrow into the wind. The price paid for mercury was more than money. It was life, slowly stolen by an invisible poison. The desert remembers those lives, and it keeps their spirits close, trapped in the dust and silence. It waits for those who dare to listen, for those who wander too far into the ruins, and for those who might never leave. Because in Terlingua, the dead don't just rest. They cough, they whisper, they watch, and they wait. Indianola was once a jewel on the Texas coast, a place where the land seemed to bow down to the sea, opening wide to welcome ships from distant shores. It was more than a town. It was a gateway, a hopeful promise wrapped in salt and wood and the shouts of sailors. In the mid-1800s, waves of immigrants poured in, German, Irish, Italian, looking for a new life, a fresh start far from the old country's troubles. The streets of Indianola bustled with the clatter of horse-drawn carts, children's laughter, and the melodic clang of shipyard hammers. The harbor was alive with masts and sails, the smell of fish and tar thick in the air. People worked hard here, their hands weathered and strong, building a town out of sand and dreams. But the sea had its own plans. The first hurricane struck in 1875, a beast with eyes of fire and breath of death. The sky turned black as ink, the wind screamed like a banshee, and the waters roared with the fury of 1,000 storms. The town was battered and bruised, homes ripped from their foundations, streets swallowed by a rising flood. Families huddled in churches, clinging to hope and each other as the storm tore through their lives. When the sun finally rose, Indianola was a shattered ghost of itself. But the people, stubborn as they were, rebuilt. They patched up broken piers, repaired battered homes, and returned to the rhythm of their lives. The harbor filled again with ships, and the town's heartbeat started to steady. But the sea's hunger was far from satisfied. 11 years later, in the summer of 1886, the second storm came like a nightmare made flesh. A monstrous hurricane, more powerful and cruel than any before. It crept up quietly, hiding behind a curtain of humidity and ominous clouds, then burst forth with the force of 1,000 angry gods. The sky cracked with lightning, and the wind howled like the souls of the damned. The waters rose again, this time swallowing the entire town without mercy. The flood came fast and cold, dragging everything into its icy grip. The docks, the warehouses, the homes, the lives of those who called Indianola home. People ran, but the sea was faster. Mothers screamed as the water pulled their children from their arms. Men fought to save their families, but it was like battling a living thing, a cruel leviathan with jaws of salt and hands made of current. The church bell tolled a desperate warning, but it was drowned beneath the roar of the storm. Some managed to cling to debris. Others were lost beneath the waves. The floodwaters turned Indianola into a watery grave, a place where hopes and dreams drowned alongside the people. In the aftermath, the survivors were few. Those who made it out looked back at the ruins of their town and wept. Indianola was abandoned, left to the mercy of the sea and the relentless desert wind. Over time, the wooden piers rotted and collapsed, the streets filled with sand and salt. The buildings crumbled into ghostly skeletons. But Indianola never truly died. On nights when the Gulf fog rolls in thick and heavy, blanketing the shore in a ghostly white, those who dare approach the ruins say they can see things no living person should ever see. Shadowy shapes glide silently just offshore, the ghost ships of Indianola's lost fleet. Their sails hang ragged and torn, creaking softly like the sighs of the dead. Faded faces crowd the decks, eyes hollow but watching, waiting. They stare toward the shore, as if searching for something or someone. Locals warn against lingering after dark. They say the fog carries the cries of drowned children, high and plaintive, echoing through the salty air, like the wind itself is weeping. The sound drifts in and out, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Some who've heard it swear it chills the blood, reaching deep inside your chest to squeeze your heart with icy fingers. And then there's the story of Old Man Kincaid. Kincaid was a fisherman who lived on the outskirts of Indianola before the storms. He was a gruff man, scarred by salt and sun, with eyes that had seen too much. When the hurricane of 1886 tore through, he lost everything: his wife, his children, his home. But legend says Kincaid refused to leave the shore. Night after night, he would walk down to the water's edge, staring out into the fog, calling for his family. Some say he still wanders there, a shadow on the beach, forever waiting for a ship that will never return. And on foggy nights, you might just catch a glimpse of him, a solitary figure standing where the land and sea meet, shouting into the wind, a broken man lost between worlds. Indianola is a place where the past refuses to stay buried. The sea took the town, but it couldn't claim the memories. The ghosts remain, tangled in the mist and the salt, trapped between water and land, life and death. They whisper in the night, calling out to the living with voices full of sorrow and warning. If you listen, really listen, you can hear the town's heartbeat beneath the waves, slow, faint, but never gone. And if you find yourself walking the deserted shore when the fog rolls in, you might just feel their eyes on you, their silent plea carried on the wind. Indianola waits, and the sea never forgets. Shafter was never meant to last. It rose in the unforgiving wasteland of Presidio County, Texas, a town built around one thing: a lead mine that promised riches but delivered death. The kind of place where the earth itself seemed to breathe poison, where men dug with trembling hands, chasing something that would never set them free. In the late 1800s, word spread fast. Rich veins of lead had been discovered deep beneath the desert floor, and miners came in droves. Young men with calloused hands and older men with worn faces, all drawn by the same restless hunger. The mine was a gaping wound in the ground, black as night, swallowing pickaxes and hope alike. At first, the town was alive, loud with the clang of metal on stone, with the shouts of men who believed the earth owed them its secrets. The streets filled with dusty horses, creaking wagons, and the restless energy of men who worked hard and drank harder. Bars and boarding houses sprang up around the mine's entrance, rough places where laughter was often edged with desperation. But the mine was a monster. It was a trap. The deeper they dug, the darker it became. The tunnels twisted and coiled like a serpent's gut, filled with stale air, heavy with dust, and the metallic sting of lead. Men began to fall sick, their breaths shallow, their skin pale and clammy. Miners called it the whispering sickness, but the doctors called it lead poisoning, a slow poison that rotted lungs and minds alike. Cave-ins were common. One day, a whole shaft collapsed, trapping a dozen men beneath tons of earth and rock. The town held its breath, waiting for the rescue party that never came. Their bodies were buried where they fell, lost to the darkness forever. Accidents, illnesses, despair. The mine claimed more lives than anyone dared to count. But the work never stopped. The company cared little for men's safety. Profit was the only god in Shafter. Helmets were a luxury. Ventilation was an afterthought. Rules were whispered and broken, and the miners bore the cost. The families left one by one. Children grew up with empty beds and half-remembered fathers. The school closed. The church bells tolled fewer and fewer times, their sound swallowed by the endless wind. When the lead ran dry, so did the life from Shafter. The company pulled out. The miners left behind empty boots and broken tools, like ghosts fleeing a nightmare they could no longer face. The town crumbled into silence. Now, Shafter is a graveyard of rust and rot. Buildings sag under the desert sun, windows shattered, doors hanging on their hinges. The rails, once arteries of industry, are twisted and silent, crawling with rust. The mine shafts gape open like black wounds, yawning mouths that never close. But the mine is not done. After the sun sets, when the heat dies and the desert breathes a cold sigh, people who dare wander near the old shafts swear they hear it. The faint clink of pickaxes against stone, slow and steady. The scrape of metal on rock, echoing from a place where no living man has set foot in decades. They say those sounds come from the miners who never left. The men trapped underground when the walls fell in, the spirits caught between worlds, still digging, still hoping to find a way out. Their breaths hitch in the wind, ragged and coughing, and their whispers ride the night like a curse. Some nights, the old bars and houses seem to pulse with their presence. Shadows flicker in broken windows, doors creak open just enough to let a chill seep through. Visitors tell stories of cold hands brushing their skin, of voices murmuring beneath their beds. A man named Jacob Reyes was one of the last to live in Shafter. He'd grown up hearing the stories, and he'd spent his youth exploring the ruins, drawn to the mine's dark heart. One night, after a storm, Jacob vanished. Search parties found his footprints leading to the edge of a shaft, then nothing. Some say he was taken by the spirits, another lost soul swallowed by the mine's hunger. Locals warn, never go near Shafter after dark. The town may be empty, but the mine is alive with those who never escaped. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the pickaxes still striking, the miners still digging, still trapped in a nightmare that never ends. Because in Shafter, the earth doesn't just hold lead. It holds the broken souls of those who paid the price for greed and silence. And they're still down there, waiting. In the vast, merciless desert of West Texas, where the sun bakes the earth to cracked leather and the wind carries secrets older than time. There was once a town called Balmorhea. It wasn't much, just a scattering of wooden buildings, a general store, a weather-beaten church, and a spring. But that spring was everything. It was a rare, gleaming eye of water in a sea of dust and rock. Travelers, traders, and cattle drivers all relied on it, a sanctuary carved out of a harsh, unforgiving land. The spring bubbled up cold and clear, fed by unseen underground veins that seemed to defy the desert's thirst. It was the heartbeat of Balmorhea, the reason anyone dared settle there in the first place. At the edge of the spring, cottonwoods swayed, their leaves whispering in the dry breeze. Children splashed in the shallows, while the adults talked quietly, eyes scanning the horizon, where the endless flatness met the sky. But beneath that shimmering surface, something darker churned. It began in the early 1910s, the town's heyday, when Balmorhea was a brief but bustling stopover along cattle trails and trade routes. People started disappearing. First, it was a young man named Eli Thompson, strong swimmer, local favorite. One morning, his empty boots were found by the spring's edge, toes pointed like he'd just stepped out of them. No sign of struggle. No body. Then came Sarah Milligan, a schoolteacher known for her cautious nature. She'd gone to fetch water late in the afternoon and was never seen again. Her husband found her shawl tangled in the reeds by the spring, soaked through. The town searched for weeks, but the water gave nothing back. Rumors spread like wildfire. The spring was cursed. Some said it was a spirit's wrath. Others whispered of something ancient, lurking beneath the depths, feeding on souls. The more superstitious insisted the water was a gateway, a dark mirror to a place where the dead waited patiently, hungry for company. The drownings continued. Men, women, children, strong swimmers and weak alike, pulled beneath the surface by unseen hands. Each loss felt heavier than the last, a weight pressing down on the town, like the desert sun. Families packed what little they owned and left. Shops closed, buildings emptied, and Balmorhea faded into silence. But the spring remained. It shimmered under the blistering sun, cold and inviting, an impossible oasis in a land that forgot how to forgive. It was almost 50 years later when Thomas Hale arrived. Thomas was a man haunted by loss, searching for something. He wasn't sure what. A writer chasing shadows of stories long buried, hoping that the ghosts of the past might tell him what he needed to hear. Balmorhea was a name he found in an old diary, scrawled in faded ink by a traveler who never made it past the spring. He came alone, his dusty boots crunching on the cracked earth. The town was nothing but ruins now. Broken boards creaking in the wind, a rusted-out truck half buried in sand, and the old church's steeple leaning like a tired sentinel. But the spring was still there. The water gleamed black and deep, reflecting the stars like a pool of liquid night. At dusk, Thomas sat on the worn wooden dock, watching the surface. The air smelled of sage and dry earth, but beneath it was something else. Something faint, but unmistakable, like the scent of old blood and wet stone. As the moon rose high, the water began to change. Ripples appeared, soft and slow, moving without wind or creature. Faces swam just beneath the surface, pale, translucent, and desperate. Eyes stared up at him, empty but pleading, frozen in silent screams. Thomas reached out, fingers trembling as the water lapped against his skin. The faces faded, replaced by a chilling silence that pressed against his chest. Then came the sound, soft at first, a whisper carried on the night wind. "Come home." The voice was ancient and hungry, full of sorrow and menace. Thomas shivered, pulling back. but curiosity pulled him forward, deeper into the dark. The history of Balmorhia's spring was tangled with tragedy and terror, but the truth was darker than anyone could have imagined. Long before the town was born, the land was sacred to the native peoples. They called the spring aqua vitae, the water of life. They believed it was guarded by spirits, protectors who demanded respect. Those who disrespected the land were said to vanish beneath the waters, claimed by the guardian's wrath. When settlers came, they ignored the old warnings. They drained the surrounding soil, dug wells, and built over sacred ground. The spring's guardian, once a force of balance, became something else entirely, a predator, twisted by betrayal and blood. The drownings weren't accidents. They were sacrifices. Souls taken to feed a hunger, born from centuries of anger. Thomas wasn't the first outsider to hear the call. Over the years, others had come. Treasure hunters, thrill seekers, curious wanderers, only to vanish without a trace. Some locals claimed to see figures slipping silently into the water, or ghostly shapes moving just beyond the cottonwoods. One evening, Thomas met old Jim, the last surviving resident, a man who refused to leave the desert's edge. Jim told stories with eyes that gleamed with warning. "You don't want to drink from that spring," Jim said, voice low and cracked like dry earth. "It takes more than water. It takes your soul, and once it's taken, you're never really gone." That night, Thomas camped near the spring. He awoke to splashing, soft footsteps on the shore, and a coldness that seeped into his bones. Shadows gathered in the water's edge, their faces twisted in silent screams. The spring whispered secrets no living man should hear. Driven by a mixture of fear and fascination, Thomas decided to dive beneath the surface to see what lay beneath the black waters. As he sank deeper, the cold pressed around him like a coffin lid. Faces reached out, pulling him down, dragging him into the abyss. The next morning, a lone figure walked away from the spring, coughing and gasping for air. Thomas Hale was never seen again. The spring still shimmers in the desert night, a dark mirror holding its secrets close. Some say if you stare too long into the water, the faces will look back, hungry, waiting, and ready to pull you under. The lost watering hole of Balmorhia is a place where the past never truly dies, where the desert keeps its promises with cold, unyielding teeth. And if you listen, the water still calls, singing a lullaby for the drowned, forever hungry for the next soul to join its silent chorus. Luckenbach wasn't always the postcard-perfect country music stop it is today. Before the pickup trucks and smiling faces, before the laid-back charm and the slow strum of guitars drifting through the air, Luckenbach was a different kind of place. A small farming town nestled deep in the Texas hill country, but one that carried shadows longer and heavier than the hot summer days. Back in the 1920s, Luckenbach was a place where the soil was rough and the people were rougher. Farmers, drifters, and hard-luck souls eked out a living, but the town never seemed to shake a certain chill, like it carried a weight no one could see, but everyone felt. And it wasn't just the hard land or the long droughts. The darkness began with a man named Ezekiel Grayson, one of the first settlers in the area. Old Ezekiel was a hard man, known to keep to himself, a stranger even to the few folks who called Luckenbach home. One summer night in 1921, he was found dead in the woods just outside town, but no one could explain how. His body was pale and cold, twisted at an odd angle like he'd been thrown there. The strange thing, his eyes were wide open, staring blankly into the night, and his mouth was twisted into a silent scream. Some said Ezekiel was cursed, or that he'd dabbled in something dark and paid the price. Others whispered that the woods themselves were alive, angry at the settlers who'd come to carve up their land. After Ezekiel's death, a string of disappearances began. Neighbors vanishing without a trace, livestock found slaughtered with no signs of struggle, eerie sounds in the dead of night. By the time the 1940s rolled around, Luckenbach was a ghost of what it might have been, with more stories of loss and sorrow than people left to tell them. The heart of the town was the old dance hall, built in the early 1900s. The wooden floors were worn from years of boot stomping, laughter, and music that once filled the air like a lifeline. But after the disappearances, the music stopped, the dances ended, and the hall fell silent, except for the creaks and groans of old wood settling under the weight of forgotten memories. Folks say that even now, when the night wind blows just right, you can hear the faint, sorrowful sound of a fiddle playing inside that dance hall. It's a slow, mournful tune, like someone trying to tell a story long buried. No one dares go inside after dark, but visitors to Luckenbach swear they hear footsteps on the floorboards when the hall should be empty. Sometimes, just sometimes, a shadow will dance alone in the moonlight, twisting and turning like it's stuck between worlds. One night, a young man named Henry McAllister, a city boy and skeptic, came to Luckenbach looking for a story. He didn't believe in curses or ghosts, but Henry wasn't prepared for what he found. Henry stayed at the one remaining inn, a place smelling of old wood and dust. As midnight approached, he heard the music, low and haunting, slipping through the cracked window. Drawn by a mix of fear and fascination, he walked down to the dance hall, where the doors creaked open as if inviting him in. Inside, the air was thick with cold. The wooden floorboards seemed to pulse beneath his feet. Henry saw no one, but the fiddle played on, sorrowful and unending. Then, out of the shadows, a figure appeared. A woman in a tattered dress, her eyes hollow, but full of grief. She reached for Henry, her voice a whisper, "Dance with me, before the music dies." Henry tried to back away, but his feet moved as if tied to the floor, pulled toward the spectral dancer. The music swelled, faster and louder, echoing through the empty hall, like a heartbeat. And then, silence. Henry was found the next morning, collapsed by the door, eyes wide with terror and lips trembling, unable to speak what he'd seen. Luckenbach refused to die. It stayed hidden in the hills, wrapped in a veil of sorrow and song. The old curse, some say, still holds the town in its grip, spinning its ghostly dances long after the music should have stopped. So, if you ever find yourself in Luckenbach, and the night falls quiet, except for a faint fiddle somewhere in the distance, listen close. The town might just be calling you to dance, and once you start, it's hard to ever stop.